Welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today I have with me Greg Piefer, founder and CEO of Shine Technologies, a nuclear fusion company mastering more immediate applications of fusion, like inspecting industrial components through neutron imaging and producing cancer-fighting medicine. And in this episode, we'll be discussing the use of nuclear technologies to develop radiopharmaceuticals, otherwise known as nuclear medicine. Welcome to the podcast, Greg.
Thanks, Nicole. It's great to be here.
Now, you and I have actually spoken before, Greg, a couple of years ago now, on the topic of medical-grade isotopes and US national security, so no small matters. Specifically, we explored how more than 40 million patients a year at that point, approximately half of which were in North America, rely on, and I apologize for pronunciation here, listeners, molybdenum-99 or Mo-99, a radioactive isotope used for patient diagnostics and treatment, and also Shine-produced ytterbium, irradiated to form lutetium-177 or Lu-177, another vital medical isotope that has shown promising results in the fight against cancer, but which, when we spoke, Greg and I, was solely produced in Russia. Unfortunately, our interview back then didn't make it onto the site, and I do apologize, Greg, but today this podcast provides an ideal opportunity to refer back to that conversation. So, to kick things off, Greg, perhaps you could share a little bit about yourself with our listeners and describe the passions and the journey that led you to doing what you do today with Shine.
Yeah, for sure. So I was a nerdy kid when I was little and read about things like particle accelerators and fusion reactors. And so the die was cast pretty early that I wanted to play a role in bringing new technology along those lines to humans to help improve lives. And I think pretty early on realized the potential for nuclear fusion to be incredibly transformative for humankind. Just because essentially the fuel supply is unlimited. And so if you could master doing fusion cheaply, you would remove a fuel as a constraint on energy. And essentially, as technology got cheaper and cheaper, you would have no cap on human growth that was imposed by energy. So it would be an entirely new paradigm for us, a bit like when pre-humanoids discovered fire, a million years ago. You could look around the world and you couldn't possibly imagine burning all of the wood or all of the resources. That's where we're at with fusion today. You look out in the universe and that's where all of the universe's energy comes from, and the fuel supply seems completely inexhaustible. So the promise of it isn't just carbon emissions. There is no carbon emissions, but the promise of it is that it essentially uncaps energy as a constraint on human growth. And so that's something that I'm really excited to play a role in. So along those lines, I ended up doing PhD studies at the University of Wisconsin in fusion engineering program. And our goal was to try and understand how fusion reactors would be built, and real machines, not just like physics demonstration machines, but how real systems could be built that would actually put power on the grid. And unfortunately for me, at the end of that study, I was very, very convinced that even if we could make fusion work from a net energy standpoint, making it cost competitive with other forms of energy generation, I didn't see the technology being ready for that anytime soon. It just looked like it was going to take massive investments in supply chains and scale up and everything else. And that was sort of on the if we could get net energy to work in a reasonable configuration. And so I just thought I had wasted some time, maybe a lot of time in graduate school. But I had some advisors who said there are other things you can do with fusion, and he was primarily focused on applications not of energy from fusion, but of fast particles that come out of the reaction. So depending on which reaction you do, there are either fast neutrons or fast charged particles that come out of fusion. And he had identified a whole bunch of markets where those could be useful to humans. And I thought that was really cool. He didn't really build an economic framework around any of them. He was working in academia after all, and that's not not typically their top priority. But he was more business-like, I'd say, than most advisors, which so kind of set this idea that there were other markets you could use. And so I thought that was cool. And then I had one other formative experience, which was while I was finishing grad school, I had launched another company with my roommates in a totally unrelated field, but it taught me how to scale a business. and kind of how you can get better at things with practice and bring costs down with practice, and eventually, access larger and larger markets. So that those two things combined just caused me to say, hey, let's build an economic framework around fusion, see if anything makes sense. Are there any markets where we might apply it and actually be able to make money and scale a business today? And it turns out there were. Energy is worth about 5 cents per kilowatt hour. But if you were to take that same kilowatt hour of fusion and collect and sell the neutrons, or use the neutrons because you can't really hold them, you could sell them to certain customers for a couple $100,000. And so that's a lot better than 5 cents, first of all. And second of all, because the product is neutrons and not energy, you didn't need the fusion system to actually be so complicated, because you don't need to have break even from an energy standpoint. You can consume energy and still provide these products of value. So it allowed us to go forward with much simpler systems where we were getting paid a lot more per unit output. And so we commercialize, and that's this testing business you mentioned at the beginning, right? We use neutrons for radiography. We use neutrons for testing computer chips against radiation, and so there's a bunch of neat applications there. But I've always had this kind of long-term plan that I want to get to fusion energy, and the whole point of scaling this way is so that we can bring the cost down over time, along the lines of what we saw with Moore's law and computer chips. And the way we did that with computer chips was by having products all the while, and providing value to humans, and then reinvesting a portion of the proceeds and making the next computer chips better. And so we're following the same practice with fusion technology. And the plan essentially goes through and has assessed different market opportunities, essentially looking at larger and larger markets as the technology gets cheaper and cheaper. So the way to think about it is, as fusion gets cheaper, we can access new markets. And the next most interesting market is this one for producing medicine that you mentioned. It's harder. We needed to get the cost of fusion down almost 1,000-fold from where we were at, to do break even in the testing business. But we've demonstrated that actually all the way back in 2019, and shown we can produce neutrons at the scale needed and at the cost needed to support medical isotope production. And primarily, we're looking at displacing old fission reactors, which are the primary source of these isotopes today. So when you look at molybdenum-99, lutetium-177, these are largely produced in 60-year-old machines, 60 or older machines that are kind of at the end of their lifetime, right? They've been patchwork held together. They suffer frequent unexpected outages. And so when that happens, patients don't get their therapies or the diagnostic doses. And so there's a desperate need for new infrastructure for neutrons. And the challenge with building new fission reactors is the timeline's very long. They're very expensive, several $1 billion, and they don't always work. And in fact, the isotope business, 2 new reactors were built in Canada that were supposed to cover global need for the next 50 years. They didn't work. I think there's precedent for reactors that might eventually work taking much longer than expected. The Jules Horowitz reactor in France was once called the Millennium Reactor, because it was supposed to be a sort of turn of the millennium project. Its current expected startup date, I think, is in the 2030s now. And so reactors are not they're often referred to as proven technology, but the last few runs at getting them up and running isn't so good. So desperate need for new neutrons. We've got this fusion technology that can make neutrons. It's cheaper, it's safer, it's greener, produces less nuclear waste than reactors. And we've now invested in the largest isotope production facility in the world. You can kind of see it over my shoulder here, that we call the chrysalis. So so we're bringing fusion to the next level, and we've invested, I think, about $500 million in that facility. So we're talking something about like 1/6 or less the cost of a fission reactor, and it will produce more than any fission reactor on Earth today. So we're really excited about that. So that's where we're at on our journey today. Next steps are to take that technology and use it to recycle nuclear waste, and then ultimately produce clean and hopefully cheap energy with no restriction on fuel.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah.
A lot to unpack there. What a journey indeed. So, if we take the sort of essential fused together pillars, if you will, of business and science, and come back to this ongoing endeavor or cost effectiveness and scalability at the same time of meeting unmet needs and dwindling supplies within the sort of medical field. Let's bring it back round to what listeners are here to listen to today, which is a conversation on nuclear medicine. I was wondering, off the back of all that and very detailed journey, can you give us an overview of nuclear medicine itself as a field? When did it begin? How did it begin? And where are we now in that space, bearing in mind also those core points of cost effectiveness needing to be considered, and also scalability, of course, for business reasons?
Yeah, so nuclear medicine is essentially the field of putting radioactive materials inside the body for the purpose of either imaging or treating disease. Many people are familiar with X-ray or CT scans, CAT scans. These are forms of diagnostics where you're taking X-rays from outside the body, you're shooting them through the body, and you're looking for contrast inside the body, like certain materials, bone, for example, absorb X-rays a lot more than muscle or tissue. And so you can do that, but those are very good for imaging what we would call structural features. So what things look like. But it's not very good at telling, what we would call functional features. So what actually the body is doing, what chemistry is going on inside the body. And so we needed a tool that would help us do that. I mean, for example, cancer looks sort of the same to X-ray as healthy tissue does, but it looks very different functionally. And so if you want to image it, if you had a drug, if you could come up with a molecule that would follow that function, then you could attach a radioactive isotope to that drug, and you would be able to see where it goes. And that's actually, I think, sort of the one of the earlier types of uses is how do we find out where these things go, and then how do we tag them? The radioisotope is essentially either a tag or a or a kill agent. So I think it started with the diagnostic side of things. And just as a super simple example, um, one of the most widely used tools for diagnosing cancer is to recognize that cancer burns energy faster than healthy tissue. So what do? They essentially synthesize a sugar molecule. And because cancer burns energy faster, it absorbs more sugar than healthy tissue. And then you tag that sugar with a radioactive isotope, and cancer spots show up really bright on a nuclear medicine scan. You use a special camera to see this radiation that's emitted, and you can tell exactly what's going on and how much cancer there is and where it's spread to. So that's like the simplest example is like just using sugar. But many, many other tests are done this way, including in the United States, the most frequent test is called a myocardial perfusion scan, where you're looking at the blood flow in the heart. And so there are agents that have been developed to track the blood, and you can see where it perfuses through the heart muscle and tell if the heart is receiving enough blood, both at rest and at stress, and tells the doctors whether or not they need to go in and put a stent in or tell the patient they need to exercise more, diet better. Just really useful information if you're having chest pains, for example. So that's the diagnostic side. Historically, there has also been therapeutic applications for a long time. And generally, you're using a similar idea, which is you have a molecule that follows or sticks to a disease of some kind, but you attach a shorter range form of radiation that has a lot more potency over that range. And so it's likely to kill what it touches. Um, the good news about it is it doesn't typically, these shorter forms of this higher kill radiations travel very short distances in the body, somewhere between a few cells up to a millimeter, depending on the type of radiation. But that means that they're highly selective in terms of what they damage. So I compared X-ray as a diagnostic to radioisotopes as a diagnostic. We can do the same thing with therapeutic effects. One of the primary tools for treating cancer is to take a big, much more powerful beam of X-rays and shoot it through the body and focus it on the tumor and try to kill, cells in that tumor. The challenge with that is that you're having to shoot it through healthy tissue. And as it hits the tumor, actually, most of it doesn't interact and exits through healthy tissue. So you're providing a lot of collateral dose to the organs around the tumor. And it certainly makes it impossible to treat someone who has dozens of metastases. If you were going to give them that much collateral dose, you would kill them. And so it has severe limitations despite its convenience. But with radioisotopes that have millimeter or less range and drugs that stick to not just primary tumors but metastases, you can treat late stage cancer. I call it a smart bomb for cancer. You can treat late stage cancer very effectively. And that's where we're seeing a real boom in the industry now, as there are a bunch of new drugs that are being developed, and a few that have been very, very successful already, that are essentially providing these smart bomb for cancer to late stage cancer patients where cancer has spread.
Thank you. Can you give us some specific examples of that cancer bomb effect?
Yeah.
Bomb with cancer.
Yeah. So lutetium-177 is the one that's in the market today. And that emits a beta particle that travels, a millimeter or less typically in human tissue. And, Novartis has the two big blockbuster drugs that are already out, something called Lutathera, which treats neuroendocrine tumors, and something called Pluvicto that treats prostate cancer. And it's remarkably effective, both of these, at treating cancer and their metastases. So you can take a patient on imaging where you can, again, using nuclear medicine to image, and you can see tumors throughout their entire body. And then, in certain cases, like you essentially can remove cancer from that radiograph where you just don't see it anymore by using these treatments. There are some side effects, so it's not completely devoid of side effects, but the targeting of the molecule is what determines the side effects rather than the radioisotope. So if the molecule, the more precise the molecule, the lower the side effects of this treatment. And certainly Pluvicto and Lutathera are both very successful products where they improve lives materially for late stage cancer patients. And then there's a clinical trial pipeline that probably has over 100 different drugs in development in the U.S. alone, all of which use lutetium, which is known to be effective as a kill agent for a smart bomb.
Thank you, Greg. So we've laid out your journey. We've laid out the diagnostic and the therapeutic use of nuclear medicine in giving a few examples of these radioisotopes and targeting towards cancer and metastases with the smart bomb for cancer effect. You also mentioned towards the end there the pipeline in this respect in the US. And if we think about the US, as listeners and yourself probably know where I'm going, it's been a rather turbulent time in that landscape out there, and also across the globe. So my question, Greg, is why is it that the US is so very behind in developing and commercializing these types of therapies? I mean, one assumes it is a problem that did predate, in fact, the current administration.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, what's going on in the current administration is just a lot of staff turnover, and that always has short term implications for capacity to review things. But I think, long before that, essentially the review timelines and approval timelines for new drugs are quite long, quite slow. And I think it's just, there's a general, there's a general principle, I think, that, regulators are shooting for, which is that these treatments should really have a very low probability of harm versus I guess a comparative strategy for approval, which is like, what is the probability of harm versus of non-treatment versus treatment? And, I think if you use that secondary, for the second framework I mentioned, you would get to approvals a lot more quickly, and kind of leaving it up to doctors to make that call, right? What's going to be, what's going to be better for the patient. Now, the doctors always have financial interests, and I'm a strong believer that people follow financial incentives. But I think there's just probably some way halfway in between, where you're not trying to find something that's perfectly safe, because really, actually, nothing is. Um, but you know that most of the time, under certain types of circumstances, the treatment route is better than the non-treatment route. That could get you to approvals. I think from a philosophical standpoint, that gets you to approvals much more quickly. In fact, some countries do this. It's well, not mass approved. In Germany, you can go and a doctor can make the call, right? They can look at you and they can say, yeah, this is going to be way worse than the risk associated with trying this pre-approved drug, if we just let your cancer grow. So I think that comparative approach is important and needed, and I think it's just something society needs to do a lot more of, not just in medicine, but like, nothing is perfect. Every decision we make is a trade-off. We just need to accept that, and we need to pick which is the more rational bet, right? I mean, you can't know the future, so you got to make a bet and make a bet on what outcome is most probable and most likely beneficial.
You've led into my final question, Greg. So you've said make a bet. You can't know the future. And yet, my final question of today is where next for nuclear medicine? In, I want to say 5 to 10 years, but lately with AI conversations, that seems extraordinarily long. But just generally, where next for nuclear medicine?
Yeah, I mean, I do think given the current approval processes, actually 5 to 10 years isn't so long. And as we think about, what's coming, there's a few things right on the horizon. So alpha emitters are another form of nuclear medicine. So I mentioned lutetium, and that's out there, and that emits a beta particle that travels about 1 millimeter. Lutetium is great because it treats bulk tumors really, really well. That longer range allows it to attack bulk tumors effectively. But it's not really good at killing like small tumors, like ones that are too small to show up on imaging, because the beta actually passes straight through them largely without interacting. If it's just a cell, if you have 100 cells or 1,000 cells that's passing through, it's going to kill some of them. But if it's just one cell, it's not very likely to interact. So alphas are actually much better at killing what we call micrometastases. And that's actually important because while you might use lutetium and you might eliminate cancer from a radiograph and you can't see it anymore, it probably is going to come back. And that's not the goal, right? The goal is to help this person as much as possible. So actually, I think, but if you're just using alphas, they're not as good at bulk tumor therapy because you can't have them actually attack the full tumor because the range is so short. So some combination of the two is probably going to be the most beneficial. Lutetium for the bulk tumors or some other beta agent for bulk tumors, and then maybe alpha therapy or some other short range radiation therapy for small tumors. So I think that'll actually give you much more sustainable cures. And hopefully let you back down on side effects. Maybe you can even lower the dose a little bit of each of those as a result of doing the combination. But what I'm most excited about is actually combinations with immunotherapy. And it's early, but what we've seen in small animal studies is that you can get incredible efficacy rates by putting these two modalities together. So it's pretty well known that most tumors in the body, cancer can survive. The immune system doesn't kill it because the tumors have found a way to produce chemicals that disguise themselves as normal cells, essentially. And it's also well known that if you damage tumors sufficiently with radiation, they are not as good at doing that anymore. And so in some cases, you can get with radiation alone an immune response that helps eliminate the tumor completely. But if you jack up the immune response with immunotherapy, but maybe not so much so that you get really nasty side effects, now the immune system can even more recognize these damaged tumors. So essentially what you would do is RLT or radioligand therapy first, then follow with a course of immunotherapy. And essentially the immune system can then find all these damaged tumors. It's like, hey, oh yeah, you're cancer. Like I'm going to go kill you. And this is amazingly effective in small animals. So, studies in mice have shown where you might have a 20% efficacy for immune therapy and not even cure, just treatment or RLT. When you do this, RLT first, then immune therapy, they see up to 70% cure rate in these animals. Like the cancer doesn't come back. And even perhaps more compelling is that you're training the immune system so that recurrence of that cancer will also be destroyed. So they found that by taking immune cells from the treated animals, putting them in new animals, and trying to give that new animal the same cancer, and essentially find that it's vaccinated against that cancer. So, this is going to take some time, and maybe humans will be different. We got to understand that mice and humans are different, but there's a lot in common as well. This looks really, really promising. And this could take people who historically were hopeless, late stage, stage 4 patients and cure them. That's what I'm most excited about in this field. It's amazing.
Exciting and amazing indeed. Thank you very much for your time today, Greg. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. Talk soon.
And that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Podbean, and pretty much wherever else you download your other podcasts from. Just search for pharmaphorum and follow and hit subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us on Blue Sky and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.